This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I am your host, Dina Sabry Fivaz, and I'm a transition coach and founder of Agape Heart and Soul. In this new series, I'm delighted to introduce you to experts, coaches, and thought leaders who share their passion for being a coach versus doing coaching, for coaching beyond tools. Our aim is to challenge ourselves as coaches to reconsider some of the prevailing thinking around what good coaching looks like and to inspire ourselves to dare and truly show up within the coaching relationship. A very warm welcome to our listeners today and a super warm welcome to you, Maria Iliffe-Wood. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Dina. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for agreeing to coming on this podcast episode. So before we dive into our themes for today, what would you like our listeners to know about you?
Great question. I did my first coach training in 1988. So I think that's what you might call me a seasoned coach. I know you've been talking about that just recently. I've been coaching for a very, very long time. I'm also a fellow of the Association for Coaching. I joined the AC, must be 14, 15 years ago. And I've been a member ever since. I've done a lot with the AC over the years. I'm also an author. So I published my first book called Coaching Presence, which has just hit its 10-year anniversary this year. And as a really nice anniversary present, I received copies of the South Korean version of the book just in the last few days. So that was a very nice birthday present for the book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So how many languages has it been translated in, do you know?
Russian and South Korean.
Fantastic.
Just the two.
Fantastic.
Yeah, amazing. I published a couple of other books, which they're not academic at all. The first book is kind of an academic book, but not really, but kind of. And the other two books so far, because there's more coming, are books that have a spiritual message and are written in like a very creative narrative, kind of memoir style. But they have very, very important messages in those books. I've been a coach supervisor for about 12 years, probably. Very much come at that from a presence point of view. My passion is really helping people to remind them of their inner wisdom, their intuition, how to find it, how to trust in it more. And the gateway to that is presence. So that's my passion. No matter who I work with leaders, I work with coaches, I work with writers and authors. In every single scenario, what I'm doing is I'm pointing them back to their own inner wisdom.
I love that you say that. And it actually reminds me that when I first read your book, Coaching Presence, even though, I mean, of course, the focus is, these different modes that you describe and so on. But woven into that book was definitely the aspects of intuition. How does a coach kind of have faith, trust, that sense of intuition? You speak about that aspect of inner wisdom and talk a little bit about it. And even though it's not necessarily the central theme of the book, but I remember that these were the two elements that struck me the most and made me even more curious to find out more about what does that mean? How does one show up? How does one cultivate it? How does one develop it? I remember I left reading the book thinking about, I have so many more questions. And they do impact presence, but it was less about the modes and much more about those aspects of intuition and inner wisdom that you were weaving into that book.
Absolutely. I'm completely with you on that. The modes are just like an aspect of it and not the thing. And the reason for that is because at the time, I didn't know that that's what I was writing about. The working title of the book was always The Invisible Coach. And then when it was done, the publishers said to me, I think the title is a bit too simplistic. It is about presence. And it is about presence. But the invisible coach aspect, so the invisible coach for me is our inner guide, our intuition, our inner wisdom. And for the book at the time, it's almost, I wouldn't call it accidental because there's some magic that happens when you're writing that brings something out in your writing that you don't always realise. But that is the core of it now. And since writing that book, that's the direction that my journey has taken me on, has been really getting to know that aspect more deeply and trusting in that aspect more deeply and pointing people in that direction way more. I very rarely talk about the modes of presence these days.
It's interesting. So it sounds like actually your thinking shifted You said you had a 10-year anniversary, so I guess you wrote like 10 plus years ago.
Yeah.
And it sounds like your thinking has shifted since you've written that book.
Yes. If I was writing the book today, it would probably be a very different book. Well, not probably. It definitely would be a very different book. But like every book that's ever written by an author, any academic books, leadership books, coaching books, it's a snapshot in time of where that person is in their development. And I think I'm very proud of that book, and I would recommend it in a heartbeat to anybody still. I think there's so much of it that still stands. The thing that's different is my understanding of it. That book came out of a really reflective deep dive into my own coaching practice. And it's very pragmatic. And I think what you realize is that in all of those different ways of being in the coaching, it's a bit like the people who were like things like NLP was modeled on or TA was drawn from. When you watch somebody coaching, you don't see the internal things that's going on. You only see the external things. And so the modes of presence are like the external behaviors from the internal work that's going on. It's so difficult to describe the internal work that is going on because it's not tangible. There's no academic explanations for it. So it's much easier to focus on the behaviors. So, for example, if you look at NLP, we talk about mirroring and matching. You mirror the person and you're matching the person. And you kind of do that as a practice. But the people that was modeled on, and forgive me for not remembering all the names, but the people that was modeled on, they weren't doing it as a practice. They were being with the person, coming from a state of presence. And as a result of that, they were mirroring and matching. So the book is coming from that place of looking at what, in a way, the outward things that could be seen, and not because I didn't fully understand it myself then, not fully having the faith and the trust and the awareness.
What I'm hearing and what really resonates with me is this differentiation between what I would call this aspect of how is it to show up to be a coach versus doing coaching. And that's why we call this series Coaching Beyond Tools, because like you said, it's very easy to focus on the tools and the techniques and the frameworks and the acronyms. But at the essence of all of that, like the source of why I might choose this particular experiment or this exercise or this question has to come from my being with the person in the moment, maybe a sense of groundedness. Like you say, it's a lot of inner work that's going on. And then also the dynamic of that relationship, the relationship between me and my coachee, if you will.
It's interesting you use the phrase, and I think I was using the phrase inner work. So hearing it come back from you, I was thinking, it used to be a lot of inner work. It used to be a lot of inner work. When I was first coaching, and you learn all the tools and the techniques, and you do while you're coaching with somebody in the early days of your coaching, it becomes a much more intellectual process than somebody who's been coaching for a much longer period. Because what happens is they stop having to think so much about what tools to use and what techniques to use. A bit like driving. You learn to drive and you're having to focus on the gear shift and the, changing gears and which one's the brake and which one's the clutch. And, so you've got a lot of thinking going on until you get to a point when you can drive down the motorway at 70 miles an hour and not even realise you've driven anywhere because you just do it. So all the thinking over time, a lot of the thinking goes away. So a lot of inner work is going on at the time because you're kind of trying to make connections and you're kind of intellectually making the connections. And I think coaches kind of have to go through that process. You've got to learn all the tools and the techniques and all the models and the theories in order to be able to then at some point not hold them so tightly. And what happens for all coaches, there are times, and it kind of just develops as most people do more coaching, where they fall into being because we don't pay attention to being present. Because as long as we're paying attention to being present, we're not present. The only time we're present is we're not paying attention to that because we're not paying attention to ourselves. We're focused entirely on the other person. And then we're just being. And when we're just being, focusing all our attention on the other person without worrying and thinking about what am I going to say next and what tool shall I use next and all of that kind of thing.
What's the powerful question,
That's it.
What's going to be my next powerful question? I remember as a new coach, I was like, what's the question? And then you stop listening. You're just no longer there.
That's it.
It's just...
Completely. And you realize that the powerful question for this client is going to be totally different to the powerful question for another client. So you kind of start to realize that you only find the powerful question when you're not thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's powerful, can be so simple.
Yes.
I remember as a novice coach when we were still practicing, and I had, of course, my guinea pig clients at the time. And I remember this was a consultant, I think she was based in Argentina. And she was so adamant, like the whole purpose of the coaching was that she wanted to get this promotion and her boss was not in favor of it. And she was trying to find a way of how do I convince my manager that I'm good enough to get this promotion. And I don't remember if it was like in the second session or third session. I don't remember. But in any case, I was just listening to her and her motivation. So I was like, and I asked a why question, which is another one of those don't ask whys. But I remember at that moment, I asked a why question. It's like, why do you want this promotion? Because everything she told me about the stuff she hates in her current role would be so much more amplified once she gets the promotion. So it was a genuine question. And I remember just asking that why shifted. It shifted the conversation. It shifted the goal. It shifted what she wanted to do. And I remember at the end of the coaching, she decided that no, she doesn't want the promotion. She wants a lateral move. She wants them to pay for a particular education. So much changed just by reflecting what she said and say, so why do you want this? If that's what you love and that's what you hate.
And potentially a question that you've been told to avoid.
Yeah, exactly.
What it sounded to me like, Dina, is that you just got really curious about her. And you're really curious because you're so present with the person. And that curiosity really brought up a question that you maybe hadn't thought about before or didn't have any thinking about it. Because sometimes when you're talking in a coaching relationship, like I know sometimes words have come out of my mouth and I'm going, well, where has that come from? Because I wasn't really planning to say that. And then later the client will say, when you said that was the thing. And you see it. You also see it, like, when you've had that kind of impact with a person. But you don't find those interventions by searching in your head for them. So the way that I look at it is that, we learn all of these things and we create like a library in our minds of all of the different things. So when we're really thinking about it, what we're doing is we're checking the library constantly to see which book we're going to pull out, which question we're going to pull out. And when we're present, really present, it's almost like the book pops off the library shelf and lands. It's almost like that, I would say. What I notice is sometimes what happens is you'll be coaching somebody and this book lands in front of me, like a question might show up, but it's not the right moment to say anything because the client is somewhere. And it's like I leave that book on the desk in front of me and I don't pay it any attention. And sometimes I forget about it because I know that at some point later, if it's still the right question to ask or the right intervention, it may or may not be, it will come back. And so we're not holding on to what am I going to say next. So, this great question appears and then you carry on talking for maybe another 5 minutes. And that great question might not be valid anymore. It's like it's a moment by moment thing rather than a plan the whole thing out. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. You actually reminded me of something I learned under John Lee Rejoice. I did this Gestalt coaching diploma with him. So you talk about these gestalts, right? These forms that show up, they take presence and they only disappear once you found closure. But if you haven't found closure, they will pop up. Inevitably, they'll come up again. And so I remember in the teaching with him, he said something very similar to what you just shared, which is even if you feel that, I missed my moment, I should have intervened here, or I could have asked this great thing and now, the moment is gone. If it's meant to happen, if this topic or issue is not fully closed for our client, we can trust that it will show up. There will be another opportunity. And when the time is right, and like you're saying, we're in that relationship, we're in the moment, we're in that flow with our client, it'll happen. Trust it'll happen. So in case our listeners are wondering, obviously, what I want to explore with you today is the topic of intuition and inner wisdom and the role of these two in building the relationship with our clients. And as I was reflecting about our episode today, I was reflecting back on how we actually got to meet. I don't know if you remember, Maria, but intuition actually played a role even before we met.
Right? I do.
Do you want to share that story?
No, I think it's your story. No, I think it's yours. It's definitely not my story.
You were giving an interview, and I can't remember if it was with Smiranda or with Rob Lawrence, but with somebody from the AC. There was this webinar interview, and I signed up for it. I was really looking forward to it. And at that time, I was myself looking for a coach. And I had some topics, but they were also kind of spiritually related. It was, I think, during the pandemic. So it was anyway a weird space to be in. And I wanted to find a coach with whom I could share some of those spiritual values. And you showed up on that interview and you wore a necklace with a cross. And I was like, oh. And then, of course, also your presence, the way you showed up, and we'll talk more about it, and how you answered questions. And I noticed there were moments where you just went into this silence, sometimes a very long pause, almost where you maybe going inside. I'm not sure. That's definitely something I'd love to ask you about. And then you would be back and answer his question. I was like, this is someone I want to connect with. And then I reached out, and yes, lucky for me, you became my coach, and it was a wonderful relationship. And here we are today. And I remember when we first met, you asked me, I think, how come I reached out? And I mentioned that. And you said, and now that's your part of the story.
Yes.
That you normally don't wear that necklace.
That's it.
If you share your side of that story, then I don't know what happened for you on that day that said, here, I'm going to put that necklace on.
Who knows? I mean, and that's the beauty of it. And that's the thing that I trust in life. Like, you're absolutely right. I didn't very often wear that necklace for any of the webinars and things that I did. But that morning I went to, it's not really a dressing table, but where all that is. And I don't know, it just occurred to me to put that necklace on. Then when we did speak and you mentioned that, I was like, something happens. There is something in the ether that we have no explanation for. And things like that happen so often that it can't be. It's coincidence in the definition of it, as in it is a coincident, as opposed to something happens. And I'm a massive believer in the people will find me. Like, I remember one of my clients came and she'd seen me speak 3 years before and said, at the time, she said she knew that she wanted to work with me and now was the time. That's really trusting that. And really trusting. And so it's like something speaks to us that comes from our heart area more than it does from our head area. Like, oftentimes, especially when you're working with people, you can see it. When you look at all the head stuff, you could do pros and cons of a decision. You might do a consequences matrix, which has got the 4 boxes. And you might have 10 items in one box and 10 items in another box and 10 items in another box and 1 item in the other box. And that 1 item outweighs everything else. On a practical level, you would think that, if I've got more in this one that says I should do it, and then 1 item in the don't do it box, it's like, there's something else going on. And I think part of that, going into the realms of decision making a bit now, is that we don't make a decision from a rational place. We make a decision from a heart place, which could be intuitive, it could be inner wisdom, it could be invisible coach, it could be intelligence that's coming through us. And then the rational bit, the logical bit, the intellectual bit is making all the rationale fit. And when we see people have massive shifts in the work that we do with people, you see something shift inside them. And you don't even have to know the words. You don't have to ask them the words. You can just see that something inside is happening. And it's not up here. It's not in our heads.
Listening to you, you reminded me of something that I experienced during my coaching education. And this was a demo between one of our instructors and, one of the fellow students. And his topic was, I have this big decision ahead of me. I've just moved with my family to the UK from, I don't know if there was in New Zealand or some faraway place. And now my work, because he was studying for coaching, but was doing something else. Anyway, his work offered him a new role, but in Japan. What do I do? Do I uproot my family again? Do I leave it and so on? And so in the demo, the coach went at it from the pros and cons, right? So he had a list, very head-based. What are the pros? What are the cons? And based on the list, it was very clear for him, well, the decision has to be to stay in the UK. It's better for my family, for my kids, for this, and so on and so forth. And this is, I think, where the intuition probably played a role. And never forget this. They ended the session. The demo was over for us, okay. And I remember she looked at him and she said, I'm not sure this is over. There's so much more to this. I'd like to offer you a second proper coaching, just the two of us, to explore this a bit further. Now, of course, I don't know what happened in this coaching session, but he ended up going to Japan. You know? But I loved this moment. And I remember she took a pause. She looked at him, looked at this chart, and she told him, this is not over. I have a feeling that we need to continue this conversation.
And even the newest of coaches are accessing that sometimes. Because even though you'll spend a lot of time as a new coach in your head trying to work out which tools and which techniques to use, even if it's only moments, there will be moments when you are just purely there, paying attention to the client, not paying attention to anything going on in your head, not paying attention to anything that's going on for you, just focused all your attention on the client and being present. Something magic happens in those moments. And I haven't done any coach training for quite a long time now because of where my journey has taken me. But it would be really useful to reflect on all of those moments as much as it is to reflect on what tools and techniques you used and what you said and what you didn't say and, what behaviours and what models and theories you used. Like reflecting on those moments when you were just present with the person. And how did that happen? Because you don't make it happen. You can have an intention to be present, and you're not going to be present 100% of the time in the coaching relationship because things like the doorbell goes, things like thought about something else that you've got to do that day comes into your head. Something that the client says will remind you of something that you may have done or done something similar. So we go in and out of presence, but the knack is having the attention to be present. It's like you don't pay attention to those things when they happen. You notice the thought about what to have for dinner, but you don't follow it. You just let it go so that you can bring your attention back to the person. And so every coach is going in and out of presence. And even the people who have got eons of coaching experience, I think 30 odd years experience, I'm still going in and out of presence. I never have a coaching session where I am 100% present 100% of the time. It's just, we're human. How the Invisible Coach came about, because the idea for the book was that realizing that we all have an inner guide, and I have an inner guide. And what happened with my third book, which is A Caged Mind, which is how a spiritual understanding changed my life. In writing that book, I was reflecting over lots and lots of different points in my life and realizing how that inner guide was guiding me through everything. In the darkest moments in my life, I saw and it felt like moments of light, nanoseconds of light that guided me through that really dark period. But it was always there. And when you're in a dark period, you can't see it. You absolutely can't see it when you're in a dark period, but it's guiding you anyway. So when I think about, I had 3.5 months off work with anxiety and depression, and I went to the doctor to ask for help. That's my wisdom guiding me. He offered me medication. I said no. A week later, I went back to him. I can't do this without medication. But I want to know how I'm going to come off the medication before I go on it. That's wisdom guiding me. Finding a therapist, that's wisdom guiding me. Going to the therapist, wisdom guiding me. Going then to see my friend immediately after the therapy sessions and basically just regurgitating the whole session with her while she just listened and held my hand and did nothing else. That was wisdom guiding me. It felt like such a dark place, but I'm being guided the whole time. And so I see how that voice was speaking to me at times when I ignored it. And I see how times that voice was speaking to me when I definitely paid it attention and went with it. So that's the thing about wisdom. We can choose to ignore it. But that inner guide, having spent all of that time reflecting on how my inner guide has worked for me, has given me the deepest faith and trust in it. And so reflecting on our moments of presence, our moments of when we're being guided by that inner guide rather than what's going on in our head, it's really worth focusing our attention on that, because then we don't have to do any more work to be present or anything. It actually becomes a whole lot easier because we start having trust and faith in it. So we allow it to work through us without us having to work it out. It makes the job a whole lot easier.
And I think what I'm hearing from that, and thank you for sharing that personal experience, Maria, I really appreciate it. And I think what I'm hearing from that is that, as you said earlier also, it's not something we force. We can't push for it. It's more of a noticing. It's kind of taking the time. And I'll be curious to hear what are some of the ways that you maybe cultivate or make sure that you can listen, that you are there, you are aware when that voice comes. But there's something about taking a moment, maybe pausing, maybe it's a slowing down. I'm not sure. There's something about the noticing. It's something that hopefully we can notice. And as we notice and we experience it, we learn from that so that we hopefully then have enough trust, faith in it, courage for when it comes again and again and again. And then if I bring it back to the coaching, that when I do have that sense that whether it's a thought or an image or a feeling or a body sensation, that I have the courage and trust to share maybe some of that with my client and not just dismiss as, oh, but that's rubbish. That cannot be, the head speech again versus the heart, as you said. I think I want to take us a little bit back and just ask you first about what is your personal intimate definition of intuition and inner wisdom? I'm not looking for an abstract encyclopedia type of, I'm sure dissertations have been written, but really kind of your own personal way of explaining what intuition, inner wisdom is for you.
If anybody has written a dissertation on it, I'd really like to see that.
Right.
I really would like to see that, honestly. The way that I look at it is it's like a guiding hand. It's something that's pointing me in a direction. And you can't always know in terms of, that this is all going to work out. But there's a quality of feeling to it where you just know. It has a feeling about it of rightness, but it's not an ego rightness. It's not like, oh, I'm right. Oh, yes, I've just come up with the perfect idea. Oh, yes, I've just come up with the perfect question. Oh, I know this question is going to have an impact on my client. It's almost like, I don't know where this is coming from, but there's something about it that feels right. And so you trust that and you go with it. And so I find the best place to look for it and the best place where I experience it is from my heart. You talked about, when I go quiet, and I do this in coaching sessions, I do it with ordinary conversations. I look to see what my heart is saying as opposed to saying what's in my head. When I get ideas in my head, they have a feeling to them that is, it's not a bad feeling, but it's just not a quite right feeling. It's like I kind of know that the feeling that I'm experiencing is to do with me wanting to ask the great question, me wanting to make the difference to the person, me wanting to add value. It's like my ego is involved here. And that has a quality of feeling to it. And so that's how I notice if I'm not present. It's kind of, I notice that there's stuff going on in my head and there's a feeling that goes with it. And so I wait for a fresh feeling to come up. So you could ask me a question, I can very quickly come up with an answer, but it's more likely to be an ego answer than it is I'm not saying everything that comes out of my mouth is wisdom, for certain. But when it comes from here, it has a much better chance of landing with the person, of resonating with the person, of impacting a person in a positive way than it does if I speak from my head.
As I listen to you, the word that comes to my mind is a sense of groundedness. As I hear or I imagine how this experience might be when you take that pause, go into that silence mode and I guess listen, as you say, to the heart. Again, there's a kind of an inward going.
Yeah.
But I also imagine roots. And this is, I think, probably where my word groundedness comes from. There's something like roots, something I'm taking from, I'm pulling from that's more than me. Does that make sense? I'm not sure.
Yes, it makes perfect sense. No, it makes perfect sense. I love that as a metaphor. It's something that is coming through us rather than from us. And I love that as well. I remember quite a few years ago, I was with a group of coach supervisors. I think the person's name was Tracy, and she did this exercise with us. And it was the insight. I can't even remember the exercise, actually, but I do remember the insight. And the insight was that this consciousness, it was like it was here somewhere, as opposed to here or here or here, as in my head, my heart, my body. It's like the consciousness that we're drawing from is outside of us. And how consciousness works, who knows yet? We definitely haven't got to the bottom of that. But it is like it's drawing from a different place that isn't tainted, is not quite the right word, is not affected, tainted. I don't know what the word is, but it's not tainted by our past history, all the things that have happened to us. It feels like it comes from a deeper place, and definitely from a grounded place. That's why coaches really need to focus on their self-care and make sure that they are grounded as much more of the time.
Yes, I imagine self-care. And I think another thing I heard as you were sharing kind of, and it sounded like this is one way of possibly cultivating also that sense of intuition and inner wisdom in yourself, and hopefully then also in myself and, for our listeners. There was this aspect of self-awareness through self-reflection.
Yeah.
You mentioned, and I don't know if you have a reflective practice of some sort.
I write pretty much every day. So I still definitely have a reflective practice. It's different to how it used to be when I first started out. And the reason that I write pretty much every day is I publish quite a bit, but I would say 90% of what I write is for me, because I see so much through my writing. I really get present with the page, and something fascinating comes through. A lot of my awareness has come through writing. You hear a lot of authors will talk about feeling like they're a channel, like they download something or something comes through them. You hear a lot of authors talk like that. And so, there definitely is something magical about writing your reflections and really focusing on that.
And you mentioned that process has shifted or changed for you. So what does that look for you today when you go into that writing mode?
It's entirely different. So I started learning a way of writing called method writing a few years back now. I've been studying it for several years. And it's based on Stanislavski's method acting. It's a whole lot of almost like tools and techniques for creating dynamic in your writing, like ebbs and flows and tonal dynamics in your writing. But it's also a way of getting out of your head and into your deeper voice. And so a lot of the time now that I'm writing, I'm often practicing exercises for my writing class. And in not focusing on what I want to write and focusing on what the exercise brings forth from me, I learned such a lot about myself. It's a fabulous way of getting out of your head and allowing something deeper to come through. And over the years, I've done all sorts of different things. Like coaching presence came from, I reflected on the word invisible. Every reflection I did of my coaching, I was focusing on what was invisible about it, what was visible about it. And I've done things like using clean language questions, using some of the tools and techniques that we learn as my own reflective writing. Doing some written reflection before you go to see your coach supervisor will deepen your reflections with your coach supervisors, because the writing takes you to a level, and then from there you then go to a deeper level by talking it through with somebody else.
So I'm hearing expanding our own self-awareness as coaches as a way to cultivate our own sense of intuition and wisdom, and some ways. I mean, we say coaching beyond tools, but we also need a bit of help.
Yeah, of course.
So there's this reflective practice, the writing, supervision, as a way to also talk, think, feel things through. I come back to this quiet. It sounds like this moments of quiet, of silence, of this inward going seems quite important. Again, kind of pulling from that more than just us, that bigger sense of consciousness. What else would you say is important in your own practice, in your own way of tapping into your intuition and wisdom?
So I just wanted to say something around the self-awareness. I work with a lot of people and they will tell me that they're very self-aware. So if I say to them, okay, tell me about all your weaknesses, they'll list them. If I say to them, right, I want you to tell me everything that's great about you, they don't say very much. When we talk about self-awareness, we're often talking about understanding all our weak spots and our blind spots, or trying to find our blind spots. When I think about self-awareness, what I want to focus people on is that core being of who we are. The self that is not contaminated by our conditioning. The self that is not tainted by the thoughts that are in our head. The self that is always okay no matter what. That part of us that can never be broken, that's completely intangible, and we get conditioned out of paying it attention. We get conditioned into thinking we're all the noise that goes on in our heads, and there's a part of us that isn't all of the noise that is in our heads. And that's the self that I want to draw people's attention to. That's the self that is eminently trustworthy for that person. That's the self that is the guiding part of them. And we can kind of somehow switch ourselves off from it, but we can't fully switch ourselves off from it because we wouldn't be here if we did. But that part of who we are, that's the self that I want people to focus their attention on.
I don't know if I'm digressing us, but I mentioned earlier this going inward. And then as I was listening to your words, I realized, but it's not an inward of kind of being lost in my own inner conditioned, I guess, thoughts. And it's an inward that's allowing me to connect to a bigger outward. Again, this something that's more than maybe those beyond the experiences and the conditioning and the you shoulds and coulds. So yes, there is an inward, but it's an inward to connect to something that's so much wider, so much bigger. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
you're making perfect sense to me.
I hope to the listeners too.
Yeah, I'm sure. The thing is, what you're doing, Dina, is you're speaking your truth. And when you're speaking your truth, it resonates. And when I say speaking your truth, it's the truth of who you are, as opposed to all the noise that we identify with.
We could go on for hours,
we could.
Maria. We could fill a whole series of episodes. I think this has been so wonderful. So wonderful. Thank you so much. I can imagine that our listeners would be curious to find out more about you, connect with you. So where can they go to do just that?
I have a website with my husband, which is about our leadership development stuff, which is meridianiliffe.co.uk. You can find me on LinkedIn, Maria Iliffe-Wood. I'm also on Facebook under my writing name, so Maria Iliffe Wordsworth. And if anybody's interested in what I do in the writing world, then they can find me at iliffe-wood.co.uk.
Fantastic. What have we missed from this conversation, Maria?
Oh gosh, what have we missed?
What feels like this needs to be said before we put an official close to this episode?
What comes to me is that the idea of tapping into your inner wisdom, into your intuition, is way easier than you think it is. Do not work at this. You mentioned the word noticing. Notice when you're in a place of groundedness and feeling calm. And notice when you're not feeling that. When you're not feeling that, that's when you're not present. It's not about noticing it with a view to making yourself get present, but in the noticing, you already become present. For me, there's no work involved in this. It's useful to reflect. It's useful to notice and focus your attention. If you are reflecting, focus your attention on the times when you are present rather than times when you're not. It's way easier than people think it is.
In the noticing, you already become present. I love that. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's been a real pleasure, Maria. Yeah, thank you. I hope that we can continue that conversation beyond the series because
I would
there's
love
so
that.
much more to it. So much more to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and live events featuring the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.